Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. We modern-day humans are the product of many generations of genetic and cultural evolution. That evolution has now reached an important turning point, one that questions whether our established physical dominance of the Earth can be matched by a wisdom sufficient to sustain the riches of this planet and apportion them more equitably. Our situation mirrors Cassius's famous observation to Brutus, that the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. For an understanding of what the natural capital of our planet is can lead us to act decisively now, rather than to passively continue patterns of exploitation that lead to an ever-diminishing future. This challenge is boldly stated in The Dominant Animal, Human Evolution and the Environment, co-authored by Paul Ehrlich and his wife, Anne. Paul Ehrlich, welcome to Dialogue.
Nice to be here.
Let me hold up this handsome volume, which will be
You had a great product hold there.
subject of our conversation. Very handsome cover indeed. Reading the book, Paul, led me to this conclusion. I found it to be a very powerful statement, very powerful indeed, of how these kind of intertwined currents of genetic and cultural evolution have brought us to this moment. And it's a moment, and here I found the phrase very intriguing, of conscious evolution, when we can begin to make, or we should be making important choices about how we save this environment for the future. In that sense, I see it as a kind of a call to action. Is that what you intended?
Well, I am convinced, and I think all my colleagues in the scientific community are convinced, that we know more than enough about what we're doing scientifically to say what directions we ought to be going to get a sustainable future for people. And we're not doing anything about it. I was just in a meeting in Sweden with a very distinguished group of ecologists and economists who work together. And everybody's just appalled at the fact that we talk a lot, but we're not changing any of the things we're doing. Our cultural evolution is not shifting us in the direction which is going to make it possible to have a decent life. And the book was originally designed around a course that I decided to teach at Stanford. You could get all the way through the best university in the world and not have any clue where your food comes from, not know the difference between the ozone layer and the climate disruption and so on. And so I started teaching a course that was just open to all students in the university, no prerequisites, on where we came from, which is really important to understand when you then think about where we're going and what we ought to do about it.
Now, and when we think about where we came from and what we ought to do about it, and you, I remember one point in the book very dramatically termed this a turning point in our history, our human history. And you mentioned at another point in the book past turning points and civilizations that kind of missed their calling. How dramatic, how fraught with danger is this? How important a turning point is this, Paul?
Well, I think we're in a unique situation in the following sense. As you know, the planet is littered with the remains of past civilizations that didn't make it. Easter Island, even the Romans, the Tigris and Euphrates Valley civilizations and so on, they were all local or regional. When they collapsed, there were all the other points that were thriving. Now we're globalized. For the first time in our history, we're facing a collapse of the global civilization. And that's a pretty tricky point to be at. So I think it's, I mean, we came through a lot of other things like we would not be, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for the agricultural
I definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah, but the revolution we got to go through now is a change in our cultural evolution. We've got to do more conscious cultural evolution.
And let's talk about that, because one of the points you make in the book, there's a very intriguing, the first chapters are given largely over to how the genetic evolution works, and you introduce the concept of cultural evolution. You quickly explain, I thought, that cultural evolution as a phrase is an extremely complex undertaking. It far exceeds what the complexity of even the gene pool.
Well, sure. I mean, we've got about 20 to 25,000 genes.
Right.
And a 747 has more cultural information embedded in it than our genes do. And one of the things that we're facing is what I like to call a cultural gap. I used to live with the Inuit years and years ago, the Eskimos.
Right.
And every Eskimo basically possessed the entire body of non-genetic information that Eskimos had. The men knew how to use a woman's knife in Ulu. The women knew how to spear a seal through an ice hole, and so on. think about it today. No matter how educated someone is, they don't even hold a millionth of human non-genetic information now.
That's
and
right.
one of the things we're hoping to do with this book is urge people to close the gap a little bit so that at least everybody has a fundamental understanding of where we came from, and if we don't change our ways, where we're going.
I see it actually twofold, Paul. Close that gap clearly, and then meet the current challenge, which I took it to be, use conscious evolution as a way of thinking through our moral responsibility for the planet. I sort of think that's the next generation you're pointing to. We have to recognize that it's up to us.
It's up to us, and we got to change a lot of old-time silly ideas in order to move in the right direction.
Yeah.
It's people, again, don't see, for instance, how important in our lives it is that we became sight animals, because millions of years ago, we lived in trees and snatched insects with our dexterous fingers. We're like little primates living socially in trees. And of course, if you try to smell the next branch when you're jumping instead of see it, you didn't work out so well. So natural selection made us into sight animals. So one of the interesting things, that carries over to the election in the U.S. today, because people have the idea, because they're sight animals, what really hits us when we see people? Well, skin color, length of hair, and so on. And so we have developed a mythology through our cultural evolution that your skin color and your gender are incredibly important to your talents, to your intelligence, or whatever else you have. Scientists know this is utter nonsense. For instance, everybody was dark-skinned when we left Africa 50,000 years ago, and because it's so important to vitamin D synthesis and folate preservation and so on, skin colors have been changing over time, many times, forward and backward and so on. People from Pakistan who are living in Scotland have trouble because their skin's too dark. People in Australia Europeans who moved to Australia are having trouble because their skins are too light and so on. And yet we're in the middle of a presidential election where gender and skin color are considered to be important factors. Now that's insane.
That's your chapter on perception.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I was deeply struck by that. And I think you made at one point the observation that the palest racist living in the back hills of some backwoods county ultimately descended from
dark-skinned people,
African.
Right. And if they were smart and they got more solar radiation, they'd want to darken up their skin. An interesting thing is, of course, that in a sense we do. You put on creams and so on to take the place of a dark skin if you're getting too much, sun.
Yeah.
If you're getting too little sun, if your skin's too dark, then you take pills.
I think we can call that cosmetic evolution.
Right.
But
it's a serious issue.
Absolutely serious. I mean, it's a deadly issue.
Because it ties in with the whole issue that you mentioned of equity. We're not going to solve these problems if we're taking huge chunks of humanity and defining them as not us, or the wrong this, or the wrong that. And if we're going to solve these problems, we've got to cooperate. We're going to have to even cooperate with, Muslim countries.
I'm glad you mentioned that with that power, because we're going to come right to that point. And a way of getting that point is introduce another word that comes up early in this book that stayed with me, and that's coevolution.
Yes.
Coevolution. Because in a sense, we're almost touching about that now.
Yeah.
But as a species, we evolved in concert with others.
Major factors in the evolution of all organisms are the evolution of other organisms. And the best known, for instance, in human beings, we co-evolved with malarial parasites.
Right.
And we changed genetically in response to them, and they changed genetically in response to us.
The sickle cell phenomenon was a response to that.
Right. In other words, if you have the sickle cell trait, you have some problems with your red blood cells, but they're trivial compared to the fact that those funny red blood cells are not good hosts for the malarial parasite. However, for instance, when African populations, which tend to have the sickle cell trait, were brought as slaves to North America, and then malaria was essentially conquered in North America, the trait is disappearing.
Yeah.
In other words, there's no longer that burden of disease that goes along with it, even though you were safer if you had sickle cell trait than if you were in a malarial environment.
There's some striking examples in this book of how we've ignored coevolution and interdependence by being a bit too clever for our own good. I was struck by the introduction of cactus, for example, into Australia, and then having to introduce mites to control.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing a lot is moving organisms around.
Without understanding
not necessarily
the context we're taking them out of or putting them
Yeah, that's
into.
right. Either purposely, as with the cactus was taken to Australia, we think, to be used as a decorative fencing around yards. And it got away, and it took out a huge portion of the agriculturally viable part of the country because there were no predators there, and it just spread like crazy. Then they brought a small insect from Latin America, and it ate it right down to the ground. And but we're having these problems right now with a beetle that's eating ash trees in North America, with the kudzu vine. In other words, when you move things around, you break up the coevolutionary relationships, which means that things in their home situation where they had natural predators and so on are not much of a problem for humanity. But you move them away, you put the wrong mussel in the Great Lakes or the wrong weed in the backyard, or you move beautiful cacti to Australia, and you're in deep trouble. And we're doing that a lot.
Or if you kill things off altogether. I mean, you have another example in there of just a century ago killing off passenger pigeons.
Yeah,
and that led to Lyme disease.
That's right, which makes Lyme disease a much worse pest for us.
I didn't understand. Lyme disease is from Lyme, Connecticut, actually.
That's where the name came from, although it's common in Europe too now.
Right. But because we killed those pigeons.
The disease would still be there, but it wouldn't be so bad because the pigeons, for instance, would eat a lot of the beech nuts and things like that. That when the pigeons disappeared, the mouse populations built up.
Right.
And the better food supply, and they're involved in the Lyme disease.
And they carry the ticks.
There's unintended consequences of many of the things we do. The best example of unintended consequences that I know is that if you had a refrigerator in 1930, its working fluid, or 25, I'm not sure the exact year, its working fluid was ammonia and poisonous. So if the thing broke down in the middle of the night, the poisonous fumes got out and you died. Then DuPont invented freons, the chlorofluorocarbons, and it was a wonderful substitute. They were inert. If your refrigerator burst a leak in the middle of the night, the food spoiled, but you didn't. And so
you didn't.
and so, it was pure dumb luck. A guy named Jim Lovelock invented a machine that could spot the chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere, and a guy named Sherry Rowland thought that was interesting, and he asked his postdoc, Mario Molino, to take a look and see what was happening to the chlorofluorocarbons which they detected. And it turned out these were extremely stable molecules until they slowly drifted up above the ozone layer, and there, sunlight decomposed them, and one of the products is chlorine, and that triggered the decomposition of the ozone. And it turns out, there was no life on land until about 450 million years ago, when an ozone layer was produced by oxygen coming out of the ocean where there were photosynthesizing organisms. If we had not spotted that, if Molina and deservedly Sherry and Mario got the Nobel Prize, if they hadn't done that work, we could easily have gotten to the situation where humanity would have ended. Because nobody could have been able to live on the surface of the Earth without an ozone layer.
Right.
The UVB is too poisonous. Be like living. You old enough to remember ultraviolet sterilizers on toilet seats?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's what living around here would have been like. Be like living under an ultraviolet sterilizer on a toilet seat. Not very good.
Paul, of all the wonders described in this book, I'd have to say that none struck me as more wondrous than the human brain, which you describe here in glorious detail. And the question I have for you is this, because it's the size of our brains and what we can do with them that clearly has made us the dominant animal on this planet, with all that implies and all we have not yet lived up to. But was there, in a sense, in this evolution, this development of this powerful engine, a great leap forward that's kind of hard to explain? You use the phrase wetware at one point. There's some kind of change that happens.
It's interestingly complicated. It much focuses on probably our most distinguishing characteristic for living organisms, namely language with syntax, which made a huge difference. In our rise to dominance, we obviously couldn't have done it without language with syntax. Unfortunately, the tape recorders from back 50,000 years ago are truly lousy. Like the bits of stone grind against each other and the tape falls apart. There are two basic ideas, and I'm not sure which is correct. One of my closest colleagues, and a guy I think is absolutely brilliant, thinks that the Great Leap Forward, and about 50,000 years ago, according to some people, and this is also controversial, you got a very sudden change in cultural evolution. All we can do to trace cultural evolution looking way back is stone tools. If we had wooden tools, they didn't last, and so on. And the first stone tool cultures lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, very slow changing. There are several stages, but they're each, a million or hundreds of thousands or a million years old. And then suddenly, about 50,000 years ago, began to get needles, bone tools, bone spear points, also, and cave painting, and so on. Some people claim that the record is just lousy. You can find equally good stuff almost 75,000 years. Nobody really knows for sure. But the issue is, what changed? Was it a gradual cultural change, and that we just see because of the sampling of the past, this apparent discontinuity? Or was there a sudden change in the human brain, in the ability of the brain to do language in particular, that caused this rapid change? But we did change incredibly rapidly. Remember, we come from a period of a couple million years of just seeing little tiny differences in stone tools. And then in the last 50,000 years, we've developed agriculture and radio and TV and
all these other wonders.
And we know pretty well it's the same brain since 50,000 years ago, but we don't know whether the wetware changed then or not.
Yeah. It was one of the consequences of whatever happened, the phrase you used, the theory of mind. And this business of theory of mind, here's what I interpret it. You tell me if this is right or wrong. I thought you meant theory of mind. I think I have a mind, and then I know that you think that you have one, and I can appeal to it.
You're exactly right. We've detected this, again, a little controversy. I don't want to tell you, science rarely proves anything. You can detect something like it in chimpanzees, but the basic idea is, and something is extremely important to us, you can have empathy. You realize that other individuals are intentional, that they've got thoughts, that they're thinking about you, and that's what's called a theory of mind. Clearly, most animals don't have a theory of mind.
That's the basis for empathy, really.
That's right. And if you don't, empathy and ethics, you got to have language and a theory of mind. Language for ethics, because ethics are agreed upon norms of behavior. If you don't have language, you can't agree on them.
You can't express them. Yeah.
But one of the things that I think is absolutely crucial is it's been going on very slowly in cultural evolution. The technological part of cultural evolution has been going like crazy. That's how we become dominant. The ethical part has been going very slowly.
I'm glad to hear you say, because when we were talking earlier, that's what I meant by the need for a conscious moral evolution.
This isn't the problem. So people say that ethics today is they're just footnotes on Plato.
Yeah.
I mean, the problems that puzzled Plato are still puzzling us. We have made progress. Slavery is fading away. We treat animals better and so on, but we still haven't gotten our ethical evolution, particularly to the point where we care for people at greater distance. We're still a small group animal, normal size, 100, 150 people, hunters and gatherers for most of our several 100,000 years of history as Homo sapiens. And we're trying to live in groups of billions.
Yeah.
If you check out individual people like you and me, we generally have about 150 people in our group. In other words, the group size hasn't changed, but we're now embedded in this gigantic culture. We don't know how to take care, how to rule ourselves, sort of.
Yeah, I'm going to turn right to that. But I can't turn to that without bringing in one of the next, well, actually, to me, the most extraordinary revolution, if you will, in our history, and that's the invention of agriculture. It seems to me like that set up the patterns we're still
we would not be here. I mean, after all, before that, there was some structure in society. Adults had certain responsibilities and children other, and there's often a male-female division of labor. But when we set up agriculture, for the first time, a smaller group of people could produce enough food to support everybody.
Yeah.
And therefore you could have soldiers, priests, specialization. That's where the culture gap actually began. Because the weapons makers knew how to make the weapons, the priests knew the incantations to bring rain, the soldiers were very good at shooting arrows or throwing lances, and it just became more and more specialized, leaving you and me. I mean, for instance, I often say to other people, if I put a pile of computer parts, if all the parts of a computer on this table, could you put it together into a computer? I sure as hell couldn't.
I could not.
Or if I gave you the parts for an airplane, we're both pilots, but I wouldn't want to fly in an airplane either one of us put together. So the specialization has unfortunately fragmented our knowledge, and it hasn't allowed us to keep together what I think is the critical knowledge, which is between those two covers. In other words, I don't care whether I can put together a computer, but if you're going to be a responsible citizen in our society, you ought to be able to say why the climate is changing and what the consequences of that are likely to be and why we should be concerned about it. Those are big political issues that everybody ought to be operating on.
And I'll see that in Raise Your One. You should be able to do all that, and again, according to the book, understand we're all in this together.
Oh,
and see,
absolutely.
because there's powerful chapters here and there. I'm going to combine, because our time is the only enemy we face here, but the population and consumption chapters here. This brought home to me the inequities in this world. I mean, for example, on the population chapter, I recall you saying that in one sense it's a subjective judgment as to how populous the planet can afford to get. On the other hand, it's likely to be at 9 billion by mid-century, and we somehow know that's
too many.
Way
well,
too many.
Even we probably can't even support that at a battery chicken level of life, where none of us do anything but get a minimum of food.
Well, that battery chicken level of life is absolutely just the way to put it, because it looks like for large portions of this world, that's all they're getting right now.
I mean, we are moving towards a fortress land.
The consumption is really the problem here.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't say consumption is more important than population or vice versa, any more than you can say that the width of a rectangle is more important to its area than its length. They're inextricably tied together.
Right.
And what people have to realize is if you double your consumption and you want to have the same pressure on the environment you had before, you got to halve your population, or vice versa. And so what we have to do is decide, first of all, what standard of living we want to have, and then decide how many people that's possible for. And of course, the situation today that is truly disgusting is we still, I mean, when I was born, there were 2 billion people on the planet. When I wrote The Population Bomb, there was 3.5 billion. We now have 6.7, and by many standards, 3 billion of them, more than 50% more than were alive, are living lives most of us would consider utter misery.
Under $2 a day.
Yeah. All right. Now there's something like, the World Bank said something like 1.25 billion are under $1.25 a day. You know, you don't live a very rich life on $1.25 a day. The problem with consumption, we understand how to solve the population problem. It's mostly giving women decent lives and job opportunities and ways of controlling their reproduction. But the consumption thing is extremely complicated, in part because probably 3 billion people need to be consuming more, and 3.7 should be consuming less. And since corporately we're doing too much, the sad thing is that this crazed continual consumption by the already rich has got to end. In other words, I've been with lots of economists, and they say things like, well, in 200 years, we'll be 20 times as rich. What would you and I do 20 times as rich? I just don't know. It's inconceivable to me that we can't get rid of some of our gadgetry and overconsumption and give a break to the people whose kids never have a chance because they never even get the nutrition they need to help us solve the world's problems.
You know, and I say this in all sincerity, I fully agree with you. And toward the end of the book, when you get towards solutions or making the challenge personal for people, you introduce the idea of people who will come to agree with you, and I think you call them issues publics. People who are, now will you explain that? What does that mean?
Well,
people who are concerned about these things or are going to make things happen?
One of the rules of the game that if you've been trying to move cultural evolution in various directions as long as I have is you can't persuade everybody and you don't have to persuade everybody. What you need is an educated, sizable group that will push in the right direction, and that's called an issue public. I hate to use this example, but the National Rifle Association is an excellent example.
Oh, they are. Yeah.
They're relatively small group, few million people out of 300 million, but they're so determined and so much on the issue that they manage. I mean, I can remember right after the big run of assassinations when Martin Luther King was killed and then Bobby Kennedy was killed and Jack Kennedy had been killed, they prevented any decent gun control in the United States because they were so well organized. And what we need is the people who want to spread their empathy to people in distant places, to future generations, because we're stealing from our children and our grandchildren all the time, using resources they're never going to see when they're going to be poorer. We have got to change the way that we have to have, 25 million people who really care about the coming generations, not just about their own generation.
How encouraged are you that either is happening or can happen?
I'm very discouraged. When people used to ask me whether I was an optimist or a pessimist, I'd always give the same answer. I'm very optimistic about what we could do. I'm pessimistic about what we will do. Now I say I'm optimistic about what we could do, but I'm very pessimistic about what we will do. We have had, in my view, a string of administrations, some of which have been better than others, but starting with Ronald Reagan, mostly in the United States, disastrous, working against environmental quality, trying to put women back in their place, barefoot and pregnant, killing women around the world by having the Mexico City policy, which basically restricts both contraception and abortion, which means a lot of women are killed by quack abortionists and so on. And when you look at the current election situation, I'm just horrified.
Well, I was going to say, you must be discouraged by the lack of attention, the inattention given to this.
Not as far as
I was trying to recall any kind of interchange on this.
Look, as far as I'm concerned, and I should say this, I was again with a very huge, large, distinguished group of economists and ecologists, and also talked to a huge number of people about this. Nobody thinks that, who knows anything about what's going on in the world, that any serious, really serious problem is being discussed in our presidential election. We are discussing whether or not gays should be able to get married. Now, my own view of it is, certainly they should. Why shouldn't they suffer just like me? You know, I mean, it's and that's considered to be a major issue. We're in deep trouble if that's a major issue. You know,
yeah, or the lipstick controversy of recent days.
I mean, anything. You know, we had two candidates who tried to take the tax off of gasoline to make it cheaper when every economist knows that it's got to be made more expensive. We're having arguments about where to drill for oil where everybody knows the answer is nowhere. If we don't, even if we start getting rid of the coal, we already have enough oil to destroy the atmosphere from our point of view.
Well, Paul Ehrlich, I've got to thank you for a marvelous conversation. And even though, in your typical candor, you confess to feeling somewhat discouraged about possible outcomes, in an odd way, you make me hopeful.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Entirely mine. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Paul Ehrlich, thank you.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed it. Would you be so good?
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.